Now, Ukraine's ambassador to South Africa, Liubov Abravitova, wants South Africa to impose sanctions on Russia. However, the government seems to have made a decision to merely keep a watch on the situation. International Relations Minister Naledi Pandor previously called for the spirit of compromise to prevail. We're joined by South African Institute of International Affairs Chief Executive Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. Elizabeth, good evening to you. Thanks for your time. I mean, we kicked off the segment with strong messages that have been unequivocal from some leaders of various countries on their position on this conflict. South Africa doesn't seem to have such an unequivocal position.
No, so initially we've issued two statements in the course of the last week. The first statement by Durka called for rational and sound minds to prevail, and that this needs to be settled in a peaceful manner. But then I think within literally 24 hours of that statement, of course, Russia moved into Ukraine, and didn't move in just from the east, but also from the north via Belarus, where it had also been engaged in exercises with Belarusian troops, and of course from the Black Sea. And then a statement came out which called for the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine. In subsequent days, we've seen the headline in the newspapers today that President Ramaphosa did not feel that South Africa should have made that statement. South Africa has, I suppose, faces this challenge, which is that we're a member of BRICS. These are sort of fraternal countries. We have common views on the need to change and to reform the international order and to create a more multipolar system. And so we saw a very similar sort of difficult position that South Africa was in also in 2014 when Crimea was annexed, when South Africa, together with the other BRICS, abstained from the UN General Assembly resolution condemning the annexation of Crimea. And I think what we've seen in the last couple of days is that sort of pulling of tensions between being a BRICS country, but I would argue also being a country that has always advocated for a rules-based multilateral system, where clearly this kind of behavior of aggression, which is the only term that one can use in terms of what happened on the 24th of February, certainly needs to not be tolerated. And certainly, I mean, we don't have the kind of weight to, but we have a moral weight, and I think that's the issue, and to send a symbolic message.
You touched on what we saw in the Sunday Times just earlier on in the day, and it speaks to what has been happening behind the scenes, at least from some of the sources they spoke to, who say that, you know, there's conflict around the response by South Africa, and that this was a response that was not endorsed by the president, that he had not seen it. Elizabeth, you understand how these things work. I mean, when it comes to process, is it the president that determines messaging around what may be considered a sensitive foreign policy issues such as this? What are the consultative processes that would ordinarily go into South Africa's position on a matter like this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, on a sensitive issue, on a matter of such, I would argue, not of global importance. Clearly, it's important for the President and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to be on the same page, and Minister Durka to be on the same page. It was an interesting development. You might have seen it a few days ago in the case of Brazil, where Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs drafted a statement which, again, was quite strong in condemning or calling for the withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine, and President Bolsonaro did not go with that statement. He did not agree with it, and that statement was not the official statement that Brazil put out. So it is important that the government is in sync I don't know what happened here, whether the president saw it or didn't see it, or later perhaps changed his mind. But that is critical. It affects our credibility, certainly, if different parts of government are speaking with different voices. And we see that in other areas as well, which is not the topic of this conversation, but it is important that we're in sync.
You brought in the BRICS link earlier, and of course there's a lot that we can debate about, BRICS as an organization and the full benefit that it has been to South Africa. But there's some who argue that the link between South Africa through BRICS does not outweigh the moral imperative for South Africa to take a position that speaks of the human rights of ordinary Ukrainians that are at this moment really being undermined.
I think this is the point. And at the end of the day, I would like to believe that we feel quite comfortable in our various diplomatic relations, the ones where we're really close, particularly the ones where we have really close relations, to actually be able to have a frank conversation with partners. The question, and there was an interesting point that was raised some years ago by a colleague of mine from another think tank in another part of the world on this issue of the BRICS. And this person said, it doesn't really, we may have differences. So this particular country may have differences with this other country, significant security differences. It doesn't mean we can't work together on other areas. So that's the first point. But on this point, clearly, if we cannot speak frankly to our friends, then that's an issue. We should be able to have these frank conversations where we feel that some of our closest partners are doing what is not in accordance with multilateralism, with international law. And here I must just add, Kathy, I know there's been a lot of debate around the hypocrisy of the West and the NATO alliances hypocrisy, and that it's caused huge catastrophes in Libya, in Iraq. Let's not forget the war in 1999 in Yugoslavia. And absolutely, those are all correct. But the fact that is the case with regard to NATO doesn't mean that we should then take a different and softer stance because we believe NATO might have played a role in this conflict. I think the way in which the country, we could debate whether it was wise in the late 1990s for NATO to expand eastward. We can have that conversation. But I think certainly that doesn't abdicate responsibility from the way in which Russia has behaved, and a responsibility from responsible members of the international community to call it out for what it is.
Elizabeth, one of the other things that seems to be feeding just into what we're seeing now is a subtext that seeks to position the relationship of a Ramaphosa presidency with Russia versus a former President Jacob Zuma presidency with Russia. Do you think that there is pressure for the South African government to be seen to maintaining a good relationship with Russia here? And again, with the context of what would have been a rather lucrative nuclear deal between South Africa and Russia that ended up being scuppered?
Look, I suppose one needs to look at the figures, at the stats. So Russia is certainly an important diplomatic partner for South Africa in the context of the BRICS. The BRICS as a club, certainly at the level of global governance, push for particular positions. They're not always on the same page. So certainly China and Russia are not on the same page as India, Brazil, and South Africa, for example, on UN Security Council reform. But they certainly push against sort of Western American hegemony. And so on that, they're all on the same page. And so there is a consonance in terms of what we're trying to achieve at the multilateral level through our foreign policy and working together with some of these states. At another level, of course, economically, the Russian-South African relationship in terms of trade and investment is on a much, much smaller scale than, for example, it is with China, South Africa's relation with China. Clearly, with the sanctions and with the war in Ukraine and Russia, it will affect us, as it will affect many other African countries. We do export a number of agricultural products to both, and import also from Ukraine and Russia, so that will take a hit. But I think when President Ramaphosa came to power, there was a lot of talk, and I think, people took that seriously, sincere talk about recapturing some of the lost moral high ground that South Africa enjoyed in the early post-apartheid years. And there have been attempts to really address that and to rectify that. And I think that has happened. Here in this particular instance, I think it's getting caught up in our resentment and aversion. Resentment is not the right word, but certainly opposition to the way in which NATO has played in the international arena over the last 25 years. But I would argue that there is something more than that. And we also need to look at President Putin's statements around this war, going back to July 2021. And that article he wrote, which was about 5,000 words, by the way, on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And then to look again at what he said on the 21st of February this year, to understand that this is about much more than just NATO. It's about actually saying that Ukraine actually doesn't have a right to exist as a separate state. It is intricately and historically and culturally connected with Russia. And there are indeed very close historical links. And, Kiev is is the center of, it's where Russia became Orthodox. It was in 988 in Kiev. So it's very integrated with its Orthodox and broader civilizational traditions. But also at the same time in 1994, Russia and the US and the UK guaranteed Ukraine's territorial sovereignty when it gave up the nuclear weapons that it had on its territory as part of the Soviet Union. And so these are the issues that are important, that we need to factor in when we decide on how we engage on this very grave crisis that has befallen the world.
Elizabeth, very briefly, what should we make of what the Ukrainian ambassador to South Africa has said about government not even being prepared to meet with representatives from Ukraine to discuss their call for South Africa to issue sanctions?
I think, we have relations with Ukraine, we have relations with Russia. If we are serious about calling out and saying, actually give diplomacy a chance, and, I'm in international relations and it's all about diplomacy, so I always believe, it's never too late for diplomacy. But clearly, we're now running out of time. Then the opportunity to speak and to hear both sides of the story is critical. And at the very least, I think South Africa needs to actually have a meeting with the Ukrainian ambassador and with the delegation. If we're really serious about talking about, emphasizing how negotiation and mediation are critical. I have to say, we're not, we don't hold any trump cards in this fight. But I think it is important because it helps us to understand the different perspectives to this conflict.
Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, thank you for your time tonight.